So the agenda for today's training presentation, I hope to cover, if we have time, on why debt data is important for transparency and for managing debt, why debt data is important to other users, why it is important for public financial management more generally, why transparency is important and how it helps to build confidence in your debt management operations. I hope to cover off on some common issues in debt data and reporting, and if we have time, a quick discussion around some systems and business processes to support debt data management. My first slide here simply says debt operations. This is a slide which I just inserted while we were listening to your colleague in FCGO. What we heard in that presentation was that when it comes to servicing debt, particularly international debt and loans from international development partners and international financial institutions, when it comes to making debt service payments, you rely quite heavily on the payment instructions that you actually receive from the lender. And your colleague there was mentioning that the ideal situation would be to have a system which enables you to independently identify when you need to make a debt servicing payment and what that amount would be. And if you have a well-functioning debt management system, if your DOMS is operating effectively, it will assist you to do that. So one of the key aspects of debt data relates to the operations, which is to assist you in knowing when you need to make transactions and the value of those transactions. Data is also important for debt analytics, and John, in his introductory presentation last week, mentioned that the objective of public sector debt management is to raise the required amount of financing to manage the debt stock at the lowest cost over the medium to long term, subject to a prudent degree of risk. Now, in order to achieve that objective, you need to have information. You need to have data around what is your current baseline situation in relation to your stock of existing debt. So you need to have data, for example, around the value of your total debt and the composition of your total debt in terms of who are the lenders, what is the type of debt instruments, what is the interest rate that's payable, is it fixed or floating rate debt, for example, in what currency is that debt denominated, so that you can make decisions going forward around the type of borrowing that you want to undertake in order to manage the compromises that inevitably exist between cost and risk, including maturity. In addition to requiring data for your own management purposes and for making strategic and tactical decisions around debt management, the PDMO providing debt data to other public sector, public financial management units is also of critical importance. Debt data supports good public financial management more broadly. As an example, when it comes to fiscal management, debt forecasts are a critical input for example, determining medium-term fiscal frameworks and medium-term expenditure frameworks. So when a government is making a decision around how much expenditure it can undertake, how big its deficit or surplus should be in the current context, it needs to understand what its debt position is. As an example, if a government has a low level of debt and has access to low-cost debt at low risk, then that government would feel more comfortable in undertaking borrowing to finance a deficit. If, for example, a government has a lot of borrowing and perceives a lot of risk associated with its debt operations, then it is more inclined to reduce the size of the deficit to take the stress off the debt management operations and reduce debt risk. Indeed, when it comes to fiscal management, many countries have fiscal rules or limits in place, some of them written in law, which place a ceiling on the amount of debt that a government can raise in order to finance a deficit. And if a government is getting close to that debt limit, then that inevitably must impact on its fiscal strategy and must be taken into account. In addition, as John mentioned last week in his training, there are risks associated with debt operations, and he used the example of New Zealand. And there is a relationship, of course, between fiscal policy and debt strategy, and there is a relationship between those elements of risk and how fiscal strategy must be formulated. If there are risks perceived, for example, in relation to market interest rates or foreign exchange, then they are aspects of risk that must be taken into account in formulating fiscal strategy. Similarly, if there are fiscal risks surrounding government guarantees, and if those risks look like they may come to fruition, that similarly needs to be account in determining fiscal policy. So there is a direct relationship between the medium-term fiscal framework, or the medium-term expenditure framework, as you call it, and the development of your medium-term debt strategy. And in one of our presentations last week, we set out the 8 steps associated with the development of a medium-term debt strategy. The first 4 of those steps all interrelate with fiscal policy setting and the development of a medium-term fiscal framework. There is, in fact, a two-way relationship between the two, and they need to be developed in a synchronized way. Similarly, John, in his presentation last week around the debt issuance plan, the first steps in the development of that debt issuance plan, the first one is to understand the government's funding needs. And again, there's a relationship there between budget development and debt management, and the exchange of data between the debt management process and the budget management process are absolutely essential. Similarly, data regarding debt management and the debt management profile is essential information for cash management. In undertaking cash management, of course, you need to understand the likely cash flows that are planned to take place within government. And one of those important elements of cash flow relates to debt operations, where there will be funds flowing in when new debt is taken on, and there will be funds flowing out when debt servicing takes place. Similarly, there is a requirement for those in the FCGO who are undertaking financial reporting generally in producing their annual reports, for example, the annual financial statements. They require information around debt, so they require data as well. And the central bank, in undertaking monetary policy operations, also requires information around what's happening with debt management. Transparency from the Debt Management Office and government generally around debt operations supports accountability and builds confidence. As we know, the Parliament passes laws, including the budget, but also specific laws such as your proposed fiscal responsibility law, which impose some constraints around debt management. And it's the role of the Parliament to hold the executive arm of government to account for its activities, including in relation to debt management. So not only should a medium-term debt management strategy be published, but there should be reports against that medium-term debt strategy, and those reports should go to Parliament so that they can hold the government to account for the performance of those operations. Transparency in general, the data that's published in relation to debt management gives certainty and confidence to lenders and investors. A debt issuance calendar, for example, gives some certainty to potential investors and makes them more inclined to participate in those debt markets. The international debt statistics that are published provide transparency and also provide greater confidence to investors and to development partners that indicate that the government knows what's happening in relation to its debt management, has strong accounting systems, and is able to publish quality data. International development partners, for example, do fiduciary risk assessments of countries before they provide loans, before they provide budget support, before they provide grants, and before they make decisions around how they are going to transmit funds to the government. And the ability of a government to report accurate and timely statistics gives confidence to those development partners. Debt statistics, in my mind, are incredibly important because at the end of the day, debt statistics provide a very strong indicator as to the strength of financial management, irrespective of the quality of data that might exist in budget documents or annual financial statements, which may or may not be produced on a timely basis. If there is accurate debt data, that debt data will be a good indicator of what is happening in terms of the fiscal management within a country, because simply said, debt statistics, if they're accurate, tell provide a very good picture of what's happening with the fiscal strength of a country, because if there is a deficit that needs to be financed somehow, and that inevitably will be in the form of debt, both domestic or international, or in the form of payment arrears. And if there is data around that, it will provide a very good indication of what's happening with fiscal management more generally. So good practice in debt reporting includes the production of periodic debt statistics bulletins, preferably quarterly or semi-annually, but annually at least. Annual debt reporting against the medium-term debt strategy definitely should be published and submitted to Parliament. Public sector debt statistics, which are provided to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and published on their websites. Debt statistics are also included within the government finance statistics that are provided to the IMF and also published. And debt reporting would be included, and I know it already is to some degree, within your annual financial statements that are produced by the FCGO according to international public sector accounting standards. The Debt Statistics Bulletin should contain a basic level of information, which would be around the stock of debt by creditor, by residency classification, by instrument, by currency, by interest rate, and also in relation to maturity, both residual and the original maturity, and also debt flows, including principal repayments and interest payments. Ideally, the Debt Statistics Bulletin should also include debt ratios and indicators of risk associated with debt, including some basic ratios that show the share, for example, the share of fixed to floating rate debt, long to short-term debt. There's a list here. These all provide an indication of the degree of risk within the debt portfolio. I'd like to touch now on some common issues in relation to debt data and reporting. The first one relates to coverage of that data and the associated reports. Then I'd also like to discuss the capturing and reporting of data that's not reflected in a particular transaction, including accruing pension liabilities, accruing interest, contingent liabilities, guaranteed loans, and also contingent liabilities associated with public-private partnerships. This is a chart of the public sector and how it is typically classified in international statistical standards, including government finance statistics, but also in the public sector debt statistics. And here the public sector is split between the general government and public corporations. The general government sector includes the central government, state governments, and local governments. So within Nepal, that's the central government and then the subnational governments that exist, including the provinces. Then there are the public corporations, which are split between public non-financial corporations and public financial corporations. And within the public financial corporations would be the central bank, as well as other deposit-taking corporations, such as banks. What I've done on this chart is I have coloured here in green, red, and orange 3 particular sectors. When we look at the debt data that's currently prepared by Nepal, there is quite strong reporting by the central bank. So it's green in relation to their debt statistics. In relation to public non-financial corporations, that's red because there's very little data reported from that sector. And within central government, that is orange, which reflects that is an incomplete set of data there. There is some data, but it's not comprehensive. The general government, as I said, is split between central government and subnational government, as well as social security funds. And when you look at the situation with Nepal and the data that is produced in relation to debt, there is quite comprehensive data produced on the debt that is taken on by the budgetary central government, but there is very little data that is available from the extra budgetary units and the social security funds. As I said, data is available and published for the budgetary central government and the central bank. Evidence suggests that there are significant extra budgetary operations in Nepal, and that includes a very large number of autonomous agencies, but there's not currently statistical data available for those extra budgetary operations. So we simply don't know what's happening in relation to their finances and any debt that they might be taking on, or guarantees or other obligations. Similarly, public non-financial corporations exist, and we understand that they undertake borrowings, but the data regarding that debt is not reflected in the statistics that are produced and published. Either those that are presented internally, for example, the annual financial statements and the internal quarterly reports that are produced by FCGO, and nor are they included within the public sector debt statistics. We have noted the push towards decentralization and the growth in prominence of subnational governments in Nepal, and going forward, we understand that they will be taking on debt, so having the ability to include those subnational governments within the coverage of your statistical reports and data gathering will be important, and particularly so as these are areas of potential risk for the government. In relation to the public sector debt statistics, for example, this is just a printout of the web page from the World Bank debt data system, and there the list of tables show the sectors that you would expect to see debt data for a particular country. And for Nepal, this is the data for Q2 and Q3 of 2019, and this is for the total public sector, and it looks to be comprehensive. However, this reflects only the data for the budgetary central government and also the central bank. I wanted to discuss briefly the coverage of pensions in statistics. And when you look at the public sector debt statistics, for example, there is a row in there which covers the pension liabilities. But they are not currently reported for Nepal. Now, we do know that within the government of Nepal, there is a pension scheme for government employees. This is in the nature of a defined benefit scheme, where the government guarantees a certain payment to public sector employees when they retire, which is a function of their final salary and their years of service. And the government supports those payments from their own sources from the budget. To the extent that the scheme is unfunded, that represents a large net debt to the government. It's something that should be monitored, tracked very closely, and ideally included within public sector debt statistics, because this is an area of risk for the government. And as you see from this headline from an article in the Kathmandu Post, it's something that both the public and private sector and the community more broadly are paying very close attention to because of the potential future risks associated with that. You would have heard from our discussion with the FCGO that one of the issues that exists at the moment is the fact that the debt accounting and indeed accounting more generally in Nepal is undertaken on a cash basis. So when interest is being accrued, that data is not captured in the debt system or in the accounting system, which means that the statistics that are being produced are not completely in alignment with the standards associated with those statistics, and it means that you're not able to completely track the growth of liabilities as they emerge in managing those debt instruments. Another area of emerging importance is in relation to contingent liabilities. Contingent liabilities are a bit challenging because they are, by their nature, liabilities which are only triggered once a certain event occurs. They are not an absolute liability, and it's not in that it is not certain that you will need to make a payment in future associated with those particular transactions. However, to the extent that there is a potential liability that will exist, mean that they should be tracked and monitored very closely. It's somewhat challenging in the sense that because they are contingent in nature, the international financial accounting standards do not require the contingent liability to be recorded on the balance sheet. Nonetheless, because of the risks associated with those contingent liabilities, it's really very important that they be tracked and reported for fiscal management purposes. They are a very critical fiscal risk. Now, from a PDMO perspective, it would be important to be able to have business processes in place to be able to capture and record that information so that it can be monitored and included in debt bulletins provided to the budget department for budget preparation purposes and provided to the FCGO, who ideally would include some information around contingent liabilities, at least in the notes to their financial statements. One particular form of contingent liability, of course, is guarantees, and ideally you include those within the debt statistics bulletin, including loan guarantees by type of loan, creditor, residency, interest rate, and the like. In addition, the debt statistics bulletin would ideally include some basic risk measures associated with those guarantees, including ratios around the guaranteed debt to GDP, for example, guaranteed loans in foreign currency as a percentage of total guaranteed debt, and the portion of guarantees triggered over the past 5 years to see what is the history associated with those guarantees. I'd like to touch now on systems and business processes to support debt data management. In relation to the collection of debt data, it is essential to have good data governance practices in place, and data governance standards would define who is responsible for collecting particular data, what rules, definitions, and standards should apply to that data, and how that data is verified, including mechanisms to reconcile the data, for example, in the DOMS system against other sources of information, including the FMIS and including the systems of your lenders. Data governance would also provide standards around how data is protected within the system, who can access that data, how it is backed up, and how privacy, for example, is assured. Systems can assist greatly in the collation, curation, and presentation of debt data. Debt systems support data capture and also enable those governance processes. However, the data in the system must be accessible, so the debt system needs to have appropriate reporting capabilities. Of course, the data coming out of any system is only as good as the business processes that deliver data to the system. If there are problems with the capture of data and how that data is recorded, then it's going to be quite difficult to get useful data out of the system. And I'd use, for example, within a debt management system, if, for example, you needed to record who the lender was, if that lender was, for example, the World Bank, the way in which the term World Bank was recorded in the system would have to be standardized. If, for example, at some times there was capitalization, not capitalization, whether it was summarized down to WB for World Bank, or other spelling used, other terminologies used for the World Bank, then there would be multiple different ways in which the term World Bank was represented within the system. So when it came to pulling the data out of the system, if you wanted to gather all of the data related to the World Bank out of the system, if it wasn't standardized, then you wouldn't be able to get the data out of the system without having some mechanism for sorting through all of those different versions of the data and the way it's presented. We have received from you an Excel file, which is a file related to the medium-term debt strategy and some analysis work that the World Bank is doing with you in relation to the development of the medium-term debt strategy. And I found it quite interesting looking at that file, because in order to undertake the analysis that was desired, the World Bank had to actually recreate a debt management database which included all of the existing debt. And I thought it was very interesting the way they have presented the data here in terms of how it is sorted, the kind of nomenclature that they use, the way that they have split the particular data in relation to each instrument into a particular column, the way they have used common terms associated with that. And there are actually some governance type procedures built into that spreadsheet to ensure that there are common usages of data within each of these columns to avoid the issue that I just described. There are codification of each debt instrument, so that it's very simple to pull out information, for example, on a particular borrower, on a particular creditor, on a particular category of creditor, on a particular currency. And because they have been able to do that, it's been relatively easy for them to then use this data to undertake that analysis of the 4 different scenarios that they've created in the medium-term debt strategy, looking at the various cost and risk elements of those particular strategies using this data and the ratio analysis that I have described. In developing the DOM system, you need to be able to produce something similar to ensure that there is a database that is complete, a database that uses that sort of standard classifications, is complete in terms of the data available on each particular instrument, which will then enable you to pull out the data as you require it. Now, it's very nice to have an Excel spreadsheet. It's very useful for analysis purposes. But one of the issues with Excel spreadsheets is that it's very easy for someone to go in and change a formula. It's easy for someone to go in and change a particular number. Excel is created for analysis purposes. Excel is not created as a database. So the DOM system needs to essentially be able to achieve the same sort of output as this, but within the context of a database, and it needs to have the protections associated with it, the audit trails and the like, such that once the data is entered and validated, that it can't be amended unless the person making that amendment has the appropriate authorizations. Nonetheless, this is a good example of what's possible. So I'd like to end there and open up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chris, for your wonderful presentation. साथीहरु केही क्वेशनहरु छ क्रिसलाई भनी सोध्नुस् है। साथीहरु क्वेशन छ छैन भने अब गरौँ हैन, क्वेशन छ भने भन्नु है।
10 to 11 do you want to do भन्ने सट्टा मैले रिडिङ लेखेको छु।
Okay, Chris, I think there is no questions for you.
Doing homework reading सबै मैले
Okay.
Could I ask you perhaps to explain to us how you think DOMS matches up to what Chris has said? In other words, at the moment, DOMS has all the external debt. Can you ask the developer to produce a report by currency, by borrower, etc., as Chris is discussing, or is it not possible yet?
रमेश सर मलाई के भन्नु रमेश सर भन्नुहुन्छ
Ramesh, for dome system, Mr. Ramesh sir is very much aware about this.
रमेश सर
Ramesh sir is there or not? Pastor ma'am also know about the.
I will respond. Okay. Actually, in the currently we are in the developing process and we are working on the reporting parts, and it gives the report currency wise also and donor wise also and loan ID wise also. So it will produce all the reports and still we are working on this. The difficulty is for us to track the disbursement at time because it is very difficult to track the disbursement. And for the multilateral donor like ADB and IDA, the World Bank, it is easy for us because of their client connection. And we are working for the JICA also, but other donors we have very difficult to track their disbursement. So we have little difficulties on this part. Otherwise, it is okay for us.
Thank you. As I mentioned last week, unfortunately, you're not alone. Every country I know that has a range of donors has exactly the same problem. So please don't think that it's a special problem for you. Everybody has this problem keeping track of disbursements.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you, Chris. That was a very good presentation. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll meet some of you tomorrow, I think in the meeting with Nepal Rashtra Bank. Otherwise, we'll meet you all again day after, I think, for the training session 7. So thank you very much. Have a good evening. And we'll see you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, sir.